Hi everyone, I'm going to talk about the film Tomorrow is Forever, which is an American film produced in 1946. In the cast, we can see Claudette Colbert, Orson Welles, and also the future star Natalie Wood, among others. It talks about a couple, Elizabeth and John. They were very happily married. However, it was World War I, and John went to fight in the World War I, and they were temporarily separated. However, at the end of the World War I, Elizabeth learns of the death of her husband, John, and she was really depressed with that. However, she was pregnant and had no idea of that. She was pregnant, and the father was John, her deceased husband. And there was a man, Mr. Hamilton, and he secretly loved her. But she was married, and he never tried anything. He was a good and decent man. When Mr. Hamilton knew of the death of Elizabeth's husband and that she was pregnant, he talked to one of his employees at home with one of his relatives, and they decided, Mr. Hamilton and this elderly lady, to bring Elizabeth to her home so she could have a more relaxed, less stressful pregnancy. And Mr. Hamilton was a very wealthy man. So Elizabeth would have all resources and all pieces to have a quiet pregnancy. Okay, Elizabeth had her baby, and Mr. Hamilton got very attached to the boy, and he still loved Elizabeth. One day, he told Elizabeth of his love, and he proposed her, and he told her that he already considered the baby as his son, and that they could both raise the baby as their child. Elizabeth was a bit reluctant because she still loved John. She told Mr. Hamilton that she still loved John, but they got married anyway. And they got to build a very happy family. The baby grew up. Mr. Hamilton and Elizabeth had another son of their own, and they had a very happy and united family. Okay, once, after 20 years, Mr. Hamilton hires Mr. Kessler, who was an Austrian chemist, to work in his company. However, John, Elizabeth's husband, he never died. He was alive. However, he was badly hurt in the war. His face was disfigured, and he underwent lots of plastic surgeries. And the doctor always asked John, "Don't you want to tell your wife that you are alive? Your wife certainly thinks that you are dead." But John adamantly resisted because he didn't want Elizabeth to see him in that state, and he didn't want Elizabeth to nurse him because all the wounds he had in the war really affected his health. So he preferred to leave Elizabeth alone, think she had passed away, so she could have a better life. However, Mr. Kessler was John with a new identity. And he was, by chance, hired to work in Mr. Hamilton's company. Mr. Hamilton was Elizabeth's husband. But John, who was Mr. Kessler, didn't know about it. And then he found it out, and he got very surprised. John, with the identity of Mr. Kessler, he had adopted a little girl who was Natalie Wood, the actress Natalie Wood. The girl was called Margaret, and it was the daughter of that doctor who took care of him. However, that doctor who took care of him during World War I, he was murdered by the Nazis with his wife, and Margaret, the little girl, she was orphan. So John, Mr. Kessler, who were the same person, decided to adopt her. And there was a kind of conflict between Mr. Kessler and Elizabeth because Drew, who was Elizabeth's son and whose father was John, and he realized that soon. Dr. Kessler, he supported Drew's idea to fight in World War II. And of course that Elizabeth refused to allow that because she didn't want to lose her son in the same way she had lost her first husband. And at first it was a kind of delicate situation. However, when they knew that Margaret couldn't even hear the sound of shootings, even if it was a toy revolver, because she was very traumatized by the death of her parents, then Elizabeth realized that she was exaggerating, that she shouldn't treat Dr. Kessler badly because he had his reasons to hate the Nazis. However, time passed, and Elizabeth, of course, realized that Dr. Kessler was John, her husband. But her husband refused to say his real identity and begged Elizabeth to live in the present, not in the past, because the past is over. And even if John was still alive, it would never be the same thing as in the past. One day, Drew decided to go to war anyway, and he left without the authorization of his parents. However, Drew was a minor. He wasn't 21 years old yet. So that his parents and any adult had legal powers to stop him from going. And when Mr. Kessler knew that Drew had gone to war anyway, without the permission of his family, he tried to find Drew. And he got to find Drew, and he scolded Drew, said that he wasn't being fair with his mother, he wasn't being fair with his family, and he took Drew home. Because Drew, deep inside, he knew that he was still a minor and that he couldn't go away if his parents didn't allow it. Dr. Kessler got to find him in the train station when Drew was about to go. However, it was raining a lot that night. And Dr. Kessler, he was already a man who had health problems. And he was in the middle of that downpour for a long time, and he felt instantly sick. But he took Drew home, and people were grateful to him, except Elizabeth. Elizabeth was very angry. She showed Dr. Kessler all the presents that John had given her, asked him if he remembered. Dr. Kessler resisted to say that he was John. He asked Elizabeth to forget the past. And at the same time, Dr. Kessler was feeling very, very sick, but he still had some strength to go home. And he tried to burn the letters of Elizabeth that he still kept. The letters he exchanged with Elizabeth over 20 years ago when John was in World War I. So he got to burn some of the letters, but then he got extremely sick and he collapsed. And when he collapsed, he was already dead. Mr. Hamilton and Elizabeth, on the following day, they decided to go to Dr. Kessler's house to thank him personally because he brought Drew back home. But when the couple arrived, they learned of Dr. Kessler's death. And then they found out Margaret, the little girl, who was sitting on the sofa crying. She was very, very, very nervous. She was very sad. And she said, "Oh, everyone dies. He died too." And they realized that Margaret was all alone in the world. Her parents had been murdered by the Nazis. And Dr. Kessler?